Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So Antonia and I, in the Myers-Briggs system, Antonia is an ENTP and I'm an ENFP. So both of us are ENPs in the Myers-Briggs system. And I'm not going to go into all what that means because you can listen to other podcasts around the actual types themselves. But just know that we really value our freedom and ability to do whatever we want whenever we want it. We're kind of wired this way. We seek it. It's almost like this compulsion we have to be able to do anything on a dime when we feel like it. Imagine kind of in a metaphor experience, there's cruise ships on the ocean that take a while to turn. We're more like that really small 4-person schooner in our personalities. We would just want to, hey, there's an island over there. Let's go do that really quick. Let's go check that out, and then we'll figure out what's over there. We like to explore and be really quick to pivot and to move quickly with lots of options. And we hate our freedom taken away from us. However, we've realized that we've built a life in the past through Personality Hacker and some of the other decisions we've made where we have been able to do a lot of freedom things in our lives. We've been able to spend time in other locations away from our home. We've been able to travel. We've been able to build this business in somewhat of a lifestyle fashion, meaning that we can set our own hours and work when we want and how we want. And we made a big change in the last year where we realized that that was only going to get us so far in building this business and making the impact in the world that we wanted to make. And we had to stop and really start to evaluate, if we keep going down the road of preserving unlimited freedom for ourselves, we will actually be limited. We'll actually remove freedom, ultimately. We'll be limited about what we're able to do in the world because we're so zoomed in on the personal freedom we have in our lives on a day-to-day basis. And so we realized that we needed to make changes and build more structure into our lives and actually remove some of our day-to-day freedom in order to give ourselves more options for the impact we could make in the world. And we've identified that this came down to us making peace with a part of our personality that is really inferior for us. In the car model system we talk about, that part of us we call the 3-year-old. And it's a cognitive process. It's a mental process that is technically called introverted sensing. This is mine and Antonia's 3-year-old mental process. We've nicknamed it here at Personality Hacker memory. And this is all about precedent, procedure. And this is when it's done well, right? When somebody has this as a strength, about tradition, about templates, about things that are structural, repetitive, in order to get traction, in order to feel like things are happening on a really good routine. And so we have actually had to access a part of ourselves that feels icky. It feels a little bit like, oh man, I don't want to go there. This is a definite inferior part of my personality. I don't like having to bring this much rigidity and structure. This is how we see it, obviously. If you have this as a strength, you're probably going to be like, what are you talking about? But we see it as something like, it's like difficult to make that transition. And so we've made some changes to put things in place in order for us to be able to get the traction in our business, in our lives, and ultimately in the impact we want to make in the world. So we want to talk about this today on the podcast. We want to talk about whatever your inferior process is, whatever your 3-year-old process is. There's probably a wealth of power and understanding there that will really serve you well in your life. And we want to unpack that on the show.
Yeah. One of my favorite ways of referring to the 3-year-old or inferior process in your cognitive function stack. And if you want more information on what that means, please go to personalityhacker.com. Put in car model into the search field and you'll get all sorts of great resources around what that means or what we mean when we say car model or cognitive function stack. And once you've familiarized yourself with that, or if you are already familiar with it, we're just going to talk about that inferior or 3-year-old process and some of our favorite ways of looking at it. And one of my favorite ways of looking at it comes from Linda Behrens and her books, where she calls that inferior or 3-year-old process, she calls it our aspiration. And that might be my favorite way of looking at that process in our stack, is the aspiration, meaning that normally we're going to marginalize this part of who we are because it's such one of the ways that we refer to it is blind spot, which is not nearly as positive as aspiration, but it kind of occupies both places. It's a blind spot in the sense that I've noticed that when you profile or consult with somebody and get their type, if you've gotten their type right and you start to explain that inferior or 3-year-old cognitive function to them, that 3-year-old process, if you explain it well, the person almost can't help but get the heebie-jeebies, because it's a part of us that we don't really want to identify with. It's a part of us that we know is there, but we try to push it away as much as possible. In part because it is the polarity opposite of our dominant or our driver process. That if I were to ask you to describe yourself, you would probably spend about 80% of your time describing that process because you so identify with it. It's so much a part of who you are. Like Joel was talking about us both being ENPs, our driver process is extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. So that spontaneity and that ability to turn on a dime and that need for novelty and travel and, doing new things all the time and that freedom, that's a major part of how we define who we are. So if you start talking about things that feel rigid to us, but might just simply be routine or structure or standards or, sort of the chipping away a little every day to get to a major project done, like all of that just feels like icky to us. We're like, oh, that doesn't feel good. I don't want that. And you could see that in the life, like you mentioned, Joel, the life that we created, where for a long time we lived in an apartment. It was actually a townhouse, but I mean, it was not very big. What it was like 800 or 900 square feet. Very small for, especially when your boys came and visited, there was like 5 people in this tiny little apartment. And we were there for a really long time. It was very low rent. We were there for, like we could have afforded something better, but we stayed there on purpose because it made our day-to-day lives uncomfortable. And because it made our moment-to-moment lives uncomfortable, it meant that we had the discretionary income and the desire to get away from it. And so we did a lot of travel. Like we were always leaving the house. We were always traveling. And it was because, in large part, our moment-to-moment life in that house was not particularly comfortable, and that gave us the freedom and the incentive to go do stuff that would, delight our driver process. And our 3-year-old process of introverted sensing or memory had no place to root itself. It had no place to really ground itself. Like we never had enough room or space. We couldn't eat around a dining room table because we had this tiny little table in our kitchen that not all of us could fit around. Like it just was nothing about it we could nest, And for introverted sensing or memory people, and that would be the driver or the co-pilot process for all the SJs in the Myers-Briggs system, all the sensor judgers. This idea of being able to sort of relax in your own space and nest and make it a place of your own and maybe put down some roots. That's something that's very appealing to people of that type. And we were intentionally creating an environment where we couldn't do that so that we would give our driver or dominant process a lot more space to do what it wants to do. And then we realized that because we couldn't really nest or root where we were at, it was almost impossible to create routines. Like the routines were just not there. I mean, we did have some routines, but they were always just sort of labor intensive. And it felt like what we were recouping in maybe money every month or in our ability to have discretionary time to go travel, we were losing in our ability to create like a daily routine because everything that was a daily routine in that apartment was uncomfortable. So what we ended up doing is we ended up going and finding a place, a house that was more suited to the size that we needed. Like it was a lot more space. It had enough room for everybody to have their own rooms. It had some acreage, right? Like we're in the country now. And so we have some grass for the kids to run around on and the dog. I mean, we had in this tiny little apartment, we had at times 5 people, 3 kids and a dog. And now we actually have some space for that, which is nice. And unfortunately, what we've discovered is that we end up spending every day here because we work here and we live here. And it's in the country, so it's not as easy to run into town. Our previous apartment was in town. And so now we find ourselves sort of going, man, we got to get out of the house. We got to go do something. And we can tell our driver process is getting a little anxious. But we've made this choice because we realized that if we were going to get any traction for the big game plans we wanted, we had to honor that 3-year-old process as part of our aspiration. So as you mentioned, Joel, we want to talk about how you and your personality type can identify what that 3-year-old or inferior process is and honor it, recognize its place in your life, recognize maybe ways that you're resisting it and pushing it, marginalizing it, not really wanting to go there. And maybe some of the healthier ways where you can make peace with that process, that inferior or 3-year-old process, and then understand how it's influencing maybe your bigger game plans or your vision, how it really is, as Linda Behrens calls it, an aspiration.
I have to admit that I'm still, even as we're doing this podcast, even as we're talking about this, and even as we made these changes, I have resistances. We were talking right before we started recording the podcast. You were like, you're not totally like one of the challenges you have, Joel, is this is still a struggle for you. You haven't made peace with this idea of getting more stabilized, more routinized, sticking more to a consistent week in, week out daily schedule. And I would agree. I think that's one of the things when you start talking about the inferior process, whatever your type is, when we get there, there's going to be a lot of resistance that comes up because it's something you don't like necessarily. I mean, you kind of like it. There's this aspirational piece you're talking about, but I find myself wanting to almost sabotage that in some ways. I find myself wanting to sabotage this routinized structure, or start to panic, like, oh God, this means we're going to be routinized for the rest of our lives, and we're going to never travel again. Like, almost get like despondent and depressed. Like, oh, now that we're in this routine, that means I'm stuck here for the rest of my life. I'm never going to get to do anything fun or creative. I mean, these weird like overarching my life is over type themes that come in, and I get like depressed about it or something. I know that rationally isn't true, but it feels so real to me when we're in the middle of that routine. So watch for this as you start to see it. You're going to see kind of an aspirational element pop up for your inferior or 3-year-old process. That you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I get a sense of that. But then there's also going to be this I don't want to call it darkness, but there's this scary part or this unpleasant part. You're going to be like, ooh, no, I don't know. I'm like, there might be freakouts around it, or resistances, or even sabotage that comes in, because this is definitely something that's more inferior in your personality. It's something that is more childlike for you. That's why we call it a 3-year-old process. It's going to feel vulnerable and childlike and silly at times, and it can cause a lot of distress. So just watch out for that, because even as we're talking, that's coming up for me right now.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that this is a matter of creating healthy balance. You don't want to develop your inferior or 3-year-old process at the cost of your driver or your dominant. Like, you don't want to do that. You still get your batteries regenerated by your driver or your dominant. So if you're spending too much time in that inferior or 3-year-old, if you feel like it's your job to develop that and get really good at that and spend a bunch of time and effort there, we don't actually recommend doing that. There are some schools of thought in typology that recommend that you go through your function stack or your car model and develop each one in kind. Like, first you focus on the driver, and then you focus on the co-pilot, and then you got to develop your 10-year-old, and then you develop your 3-year-old. And there's some schools of thought that indicate that you do that throughout your life. And I think that there is some truth there, but I think it's actually more that when you get to your 10-year-old and your 3-year-old, or what's technically called your tertiary and inferior processes, I don't know how much like active development you do. I think it's more like a visitation and a making peace with and kind of understanding it and incorporating it more and more into your personality and identity. Like, I'm at a time period right now where I did so much active development of my co-pilot of introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. I did so much conscientious and concentrated development that I can tell that it's a little early, but I can tell that I'm going to my 10-year-old or tertiary process of extroverted feeling or harmony a lot more these days. I can just feel it. I'm just experiencing that a lot more. And I'm recognizing that I am getting better at it. I do think that I'm getting more sophisticated in my relationship with it, but I also only have to spend 10 minutes around an ENFJ or an ESFJ to see just like how bad I still am at it. Like, I'm never going to develop it like it's, somebody else's driver or dominant. That's never going to happen. But what I can do is I can recognize that despite sort of some built-in limitations that it has, I can get the most healthy and sophisticated with that sort of built-in ceiling of that process. And I can recognize how to use it as a less clumsy tool And, not one that's going to be a major tool in my toolbox, not one that I'm immediately going to pick up, when I'm maybe, say, problem solving, but it's something that can round me out and season me. And I don't have to utilize it like in the past where I used it for people pleasing. Now I can use it for compassion, right? And to connect with another person and to, see if I can help people get their needs met. But I'm never going to be somebody who, like, say, orchestrates entire events and does that effortlessly. And I think the same thing applies with your 3-year-old or your inferior. Even when you go to that, when you start quote unquote developing it, I don't think you're like developing it like it's a strong muscle for you, like it's your dominant or your co-pilot or your driver or your co-pilot. I don't think that ever happens with a 3-year-old. But I do think you make more peace with it. You understand how it is a part of your identity and who you are. And recognizing its sort of built-in limitations, you become more sophisticated with an unsophisticated tool, if that makes sense. Like a hammer is a blunt object and it's not a particularly sophisticated tool. But I watch my 5-year-old try to drive a nail in and she's all over the place, right? So you can get more sophisticated with a blunt object, or a blunt tool rather. And I think that's kind of what happens with that 10-year-old and 3-year-old, is that you just get better at using something that's not going to be like this really elegant solution for everything.
When you say 5-year-old, you don't mean in your personality. Your 10-year-old, 3-year-old is your personality. Your 5-year-old's actually Piper, our daughter, is who you're talking about.
Right. Sorry. Thank you for contextualizing that. That was probably very confusing. Yeah, I mean my literal 5-year-old daughter, Piper. Like I watch her try to drive a nail in and I'm like, okay, you'll probably get better at that as you age, as you use a hammer more and more. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So I think when we're talking about the inferior 3-year-old, I think it's important to recognize that we're not saying, hey, now go to your inferior 3-year-old process and spend all this time and effort trying to develop it. It's more of a balancing act. It's more like going, hey, this is a blind spot for you, so maybe turn a light on it. Like shine a light in some dark places. Realize that this is part of who you are. Don't resist it in your identity, even though it kind of maybe feels icky on some level because it feels like the opposite of who you are. It's part of a polarity. It's like the other side of the coin from your driver or your dominant. So it actually does influence you in a lot of ways. And if you can turn a light on it, you can start to see how it's influencing you. And maybe how you might be acting reactionary against it. Like when it wants to influence you to do something, you might be rebelling against it. And so it's still controlling you, because it's controlling you to do the opposite of whatever instinct that is. And if you can shine a light on it and go, this is the part of me that it occupies. And so when I have these instincts, I can recognize when that happens. And I can now, instead of being reactionary, I can be responsive and control the dynamic. But I still want to spend the majority of my time in my driver or my dominant, because that really is how my wiring encourages me to experience life. That's where I'm at my best. And when my 3-year-old or inferior shows up, as opposed to rejecting it or trying to get away from it or going, that's not me, or letting it get you in the grip. We've talked about that, right, in previous podcasts. And if we haven't, we should. But that grip experience, which is where it sucks you into that 3-year-old or inferior process and you can't get out of it. Now you're like just a really tall toddler in those moments. Like instead of having that relationship with it, you have a lot more of a mature, interdependent relationship between the driver and the 3-year-old. Again, you don't want to spend too much time here. You don't want it to occupy your life, but you want it to influence some of your decisions, especially if you're trying to play a bigger game. And that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think I look at it as, what can I learn from this in my life? So I have a journal or a journal entry about Piper, our daughter, our literal daughter, 5-year-old daughter. And I wrote in there, how can I, she's 5, she's very playful. I can't tell you how many times I've had to play Candyland in like the last 3 years, 2 years. She's gotten a little better at it. Terrible cheater, always frustrates me. Anyway, long story short, I haven't played Candyland in forever. I don't go and play it by myself or with any of my adult friends. My daughter has me play Candyland all the time. And I wrote in my journal, I said, how can I, with Piper, basically learn from her how to be more playful? How can I learn from her how to show up in a more less attached, playful, like the rules don't matter because she changes the rules every 2 seconds. And it's like, it's maddening because it's like, you can't win a game if the rules change every 2 seconds. I'm like, yeah, but it's just a playful frame. She's playing around with the rules. What can I learn from this? And so in a literal way, What can I learn from my child about being playful, about being childlike, about having a wonderment of the world through her eyes? It's really taught me a lot of things. Spending time with her, being childlike around her and with her, it's really a benefit to my life. As an adult, I feel like I'm getting a ton of benefit from that. And you could see your personality in the same way, this little childlike part of you, to play with it, to see what it has to offer you. What can you learn from that childlike part of you? What does it have to teach you? And if you see it that way, rather than the enemy or something you have to avoid or something that stresses you out, is, wow, what can I learn from this part of myself? What can it bring up for me that I get to play around with? It's not, I don't have to be serious around it. I just get to play with this idea. And I think it could be a really big benefit to you in your personality if you can figure out a way to utilize this rather than what you talked about, having it get you into the grip of something.
I think another reason why we sometimes resist this three-year-old or inferior process is because it is one of the most vulnerable parts of who we are. And we instinctively know this. Like when we go into battle, we don't want to take the most fragile, vulnerable parts of us. We want to take the strongest, most sophisticated parts of us into a scenario. And so when we're going through life, anything that pulls us into the 3-year-old or sort of pushes us maybe even into that frame, it feels like it's taking us out of our sandbox. And so when we visit this place, there's also the sometimes anxiety that we know that we're not, it feels like we're not on home turf. It feels like we're playing in other people's sandbox. And so because of that, it can be very easy to marginalize this part of who we are and try to create circumstances and situations where we can get as far away from that as possible. And I do believe that there is wisdom in creating a life that keeps us in our driver and in our co-pilot processes as much as possible. I do think there's wisdom there. And it's not about creating a life that forces us into that, in that vulnerable place, but it's welcoming the vulnerable parts of who you are into the life that you've created that accommodates them too, that doesn't completely neglect or ignore who they are. So that's kind of the theory around what we're talking about. So don't get too attached to this idea of like developing your inferior or 3-year-old process and having to spend a lot of time there. If you do that, you will probably find yourself depressed because you will not be spending enough time in your driver or your dominant. And we don't encourage that. But again, it's about balance. It's about keeping this as a part of who you are, maybe like a 5 to 10%. How can you incorporate this into maybe 5 to 10% of your life in the planning of it, in spending time there, in, accommodating this part of who you are and how you design your life? 5 to 10% maybe. Like, don't think of this as having to occupy a big space, but how can you do that? And so as we talk about each of these aspirations, just ask yourself, how can I spend maybe 5 to 10% of my time, my effort, my strategy, my life design, accommodating this part of who I am that I might be completely ignoring or marginalizing? All right, so let's start out with people who lead with the driver process of extroverted thinking, or what we call effectiveness. So these would be ETJs in the Myers-Briggs system, ENTJs and ESTJs. And their 3-year-old process is the opposite of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. It's introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. So how does authenticity show up for an ETJ? So normally, an ETJ will kind of avoid having to look into their emotions. And one of the reasons why is because if you're like stopping to check in with how you feel about everything all the time, you're not going to be very effective. Like most of the time, getting things done and making projects happen doesn't really feel that good. And if you check in all the time with how you're feeling, you're going to lose some of your, maybe your stamina or some of your, maybe some of your drive. If you are focused mostly on figuring out how to make these projects happen and to stay industrious, going into an emotional space all the time just kind of slows everything down. So for the most part, ETJs have a tendency to marginalize the emotional aspect of what they're feeling and maybe what other people are feeling. And it's not that ETJs should suddenly become, immediately check in with everybody's feelings all the time and check in with how they feel. Again, it's just kind of like a 5 to 10%. How can you accommodate maybe 5 to 10% more of an emotional check-in of that introverted feeling space or authenticity in order to create an aspiration?
One of the things that we always recommend is there a way to frame your inferior or 3-year-old process in light of your primary, of your driver process, basically? So when you want to pepper this into your life, for an ETJ, for example, one of the ways they can really get in touch with how they feel about something is maybe through contribution, in thinking in terms of how is this going to impact other people. I'll take the thing that I'm really good at, which is resource management, making projects happen in the outside world, and I'm going to tether that to making an impact on a personal level for people. So maybe it's donating your time or your resources or your attention toward a cause or a charity, or maybe it's moving things forward in, more of an infrastructure in a bigger contribution for society in some way, making an impact in a way that will really resonate with people on a core individual level, but you're using your skill to do so.
Right. And I think I've seen this show up for a lot of ETJs by doing things like finding charities that they really believe in, sometimes even starting charities on their own. And I have also seen this with some ETJs on like a day-to-day level. If you don't want to like start a charity, something huge like that, just getting a little bit more sophistication around EQ, like emotional intelligence. Checking in, maybe making it a part of your dialogue with other people to be an active listener. Maybe checking in with, like what I heard you say was, right? Making sure that you're actually listening, because actually authenticity for an INFP or an ISFP that uses introverted feeling or authenticity as their driver or dominant process, one of the things that happens when they are in flow, according to EEG scans, is that their entire brain lights up when they're listening. So what's interesting about extroverted thinking or effectiveness is that the opposite happens, which is that when they go into flow, their brain actually creates these extremely quick neural pathways where it doesn't want to veer from that neural pathway, which is why they make such quick decisions. But the opposite happens is they have a tendency to not be listening. So one of the easy ways to incorporate this element into like a 5 to 10% in your life is to get better at listening. For ETJs, when they get really good at listening and active listening and checking in with people, it's one of the leverage points that allows them to not only, touch bases with how other people are feeling, but also with themselves. And then as an aspiration, like you mentioned, Joel, when they're getting projects done or when they're making big things happen, they're taking the human component into it because they've gotten good at like remembering that people have a subjective experience because they've been listening to individuals.
So that was the inferior process for everybody that uses effectiveness or extroverted thinking as their primary. Let's move over to the other EJs, which are the EFJs, which are going to use what we've nicknamed harmony, or the technical name is extroverted feeling, as their dominant or driver process, meaning that their inferior or 3-year-old process is going to be introverted thinking. And remember, introverted thinking is all about logic, data, truth, like getting down to the actual core of what you're talking about, making distinctions around different concepts and not conflating them. And often this can show up for an EFJ in that, heavy amounts of data, heavy amounts of information can be overwhelming. Like just tons and tons of information can be overwhelming. EFJs put a lot of effort and emphasis on human relationships and the social truths that we have, not so much the data truths. That's where they really shine, using that extroverted feeling as their primary driver. So for this, as a 3-year-old, I think the aspiration really comes down to being a teacher, someone that can communicate the truths of life or information or the way things work in a very powerful way and help teach and project to others, hey, here's how we should be doing things in life. This is how we should be thinking about the truths of life. That's really an aspiration I think a lot of EFJs have. And you could see a lot of EFJs maybe in teaching roles. I mean, this is literal exemplified by the types of careers often EFJs will choose. A lot of teachers end up being EFJs because this teaching part of their aspiration comes out in the profession they choose.
You can see when an EFJ, like an ESFJ or an ENFJ, is avoiding their 3-year-old process. They'll avoid telling people information that they think that person doesn't want to hear. And so oftentimes that's how they marginalize that part of who they are. They don't like uncomfortable dialogue. They don't like these quote unquote truths that you could tell another person that person might not be ready to hear or might not respond well to. And what ends up happening is that the EFJ then never really finds themselves having true, authentic relationships. They might have connections with other people, but there might be this sense that they don't really have anybody who knows the true them, because they don't feel permission to reveal truths to the other person that might be unacceptable. So one of the ways that an EFJ, an ENFJ, or an ESFJ can really embrace this 3-year-old or inferior part of who they are is by being willing to share information with other people that reveals the true them. And I think when you get avoidant of that, your accuracy or introverted thinking process will show up as being self-critical. Like if you ever actually shared who you are with anyone else, they would never accept it. So the antidote to that is sharing who you really are, like sharing information that maybe feels maybe a little too vulnerable, or like how you really think about something. And then when the person hears it and they still accept you, now you've quieted that 3-year-old nervousness around never being acceptable for who you really are. And I think that's like a 5 to 10%, right? Like if you're going to add 5 to 10% into your daily life, it's not just I think teaching's a major piece of it. I think most EFJs actually kind of see themselves as teachers, like you mentioned, Joel. But I think it's also being willing to share just information with people. I remember a person indicating, an EFJ indicating that when they saw my diet, they thought that some of the things that I was doing in my diet were probably not conducive to the health goals that I had, but they were shy to share it because they weren't sure if they were going to upset me. And that's just a piece of information. That's just data. But they were afraid that if I didn't like what they were telling me, that would somehow break connection. So being willing to share data, even if you think the other person isn't ready for it, and then if they don't accept it, you just let go. You just go, okay, they just didn't want that piece of information. But being willing to share data with another person and take maybe a little bit of a hit of breaking the connection, but just feeling like you're sharing who you are with other people. And then just doing that 5 to 10. It's not like you have to become one of those, like finger snapping, I just tell it how it is. And it doesn't matter who's in front of you. You're just like, you're just revealing the truths about reality at all times, right? And they just have to hear it. That would not be a 5 to 10%. That would be overwhelming your personality. This is just kind of a subtle being willing to share information and data that's interesting to you. I think another element where you can see this as an aspiration for EFJs is, how you mentioned in teaching, a lot of them go into like actual teaching roles. You also see a lot of EFJs in health, right? And caretaking in the field of medicine. The field of medicine is actually quite technical. So even if you're a nurse or a caretaker in that, or a doctor or whatever it is, there are a lot of pieces of information you have to be able to have access to in your mind at any given time. So also being not intimidated or shying away from technical things, recognizing that you actually have the ability to take in a lot of information and data, especially as it relates to the things that are important to you. So not kind of pushing away the technical aspect, not necessarily becoming a programmer, right, and having to have lots of technical elements, but recognizing that you don't have to fear technical jobs. There's plenty of jobs that EFJs occupy that have a technical component to them, and that's part of their aspiration, is that in order to truly caretake the way they want to, they accept that there is a technical component that they're going to have to like integrate. And I think that's another way that the introverted thinking or accuracy piece can be an aspiration for them. So the next driver process we're going to look at, or dominant, is introverted thinking, which we just talked about as a 3-year-old. Now we're going to talk about it as a driver or a dominant. So introverted thinking or accuracy is the driver dominant process for the ITP types, ISTPs and INTPs. And in the reverse of EFJs, ITPs have extroverted feeling or harmony as their 3-year-old or inferior process. And so one of the ways that ITPs shy away from this process or kind of marginalize it and don't see it as part of who they are is this idea that it's hard for them to connect with other people, that they don't really have an easy time of navigating the social world. And it's tough for them to figure out what the social rules are. And it's tough for them to find really authentic connection with other people. And so they end up saying, I don't like people, right? They end up just sort of shoving away that entire concept of connection. But one of the ways that you can integrate this into who you are and really see this as an aspiration, this harmony or extroverted feeling process as an aspiration is to build connections with other people. Actually, like, instead of like deciding that people are stupid or kind of pushing them away, finding authentic connections with other people and recognizing your need to be part of society. So as a major aspiration, what it can look like, like a big game aspiration, is reputation, like being an expert in your field and being well received in general, and maybe that subculture, being well received as a person who knows what you're talking about. So that can be an aspiration piece of having a really good reputation in general. But on a 5 to 10% level, it can be simply connecting with other people and showing interest in others and being willing to kind of break some of those social rules, but recognizing that you can make up for it by being a cheerful person and a person that just likes to have fun and engage with other people on that level.
Yeah, in our INTX program we produce for INTPs and INTJs, we talk about there's an interview with an INTP, and we talk a lot about energy transference and this idea of a lot of communication. INTPs, for example, and I think ISTPs will look at what's being said as the important part of a piece of communication. And one of the recommendations in that program is obviously to shift from seeing the data of what's being said back and forth between people, and instead try to tap into and understand the energy exchange between the two people that's happening. So it's really more about, hey, are we okay with each other? There's an energy field or an energy exchange of like feeling good about another person. And I think that really comes as an ITP. That really comes from that 3-year-old process, is understanding that energy connection piece. And it really doesn't have much to do with the words being said or the verbal communication. It's more about the I hate to say heart connection, because that almost sounds too feeler type language for you if you're listening and you're an ITP. But it's definitely about an energy transference there. And it's more about all the sub-communications happening behind the scenes, not what's being said. And I think that's something key to remember, is that it's going to feel a little different or weird when you activate that. But I think seasoning that in helps a lot. And the other thing too, I keep going back to this, is use your driver or primary function. So introverted thinking is going to be your strength as an ITP. Find ways to use that to help augment some of what you might see as the difficulties or challenges of your extroverted feeling or 3-year-old process. I know an ITP, an INTP, who he actually asked people what they thought of him reputation-wise, because he didn't know how to gauge this himself. So he asked people to anonymously let him know what they thought of him and put a rating to certain elements of how they saw him, so he could see that in a data set, so he could use his strength, which was introverted thinking or accuracy, to try to understand the impact he was having on people in a human way by putting metrics to it. So he had developed, I can't think of the exact system off the top of my head, but he had employed this system to be able to rate this with numbers based on his reputation or how people saw him in the world. I thought that was a really interesting way of using your strength to help season it in with some of the stuff on the inferior side to help you get a sense of how your reputation might be showing up in the world, or how you're coming across to other people.
Yeah. And so the major aspiration is recognizing your impact on others and their impact on you. So your reputation and how others are receiving you. And of course, just almost like on the flip side of what we talked about before, if you're an EFJ and you're in, say, the health industry, and you integrate the piece of you that needs to be highly technical in order to get other people's needs met, the reverse can also be, kind of seen as sort of the photo negative for ITPs, which is if you are an expert in something and you are highly technical, it's hard to make an impact if you can't sell yourself, right? If you can't create a connection with another person and have them go, I like you, and I'm giving you credibility because I like and trust you. And so therefore I'm going to receive your information, your expertise. So it's like the part of you kind of have to make peace with and integrate just on a 5 to 10% level in order to, get the goals of your driver dominant process accomplished. And in this way it becomes that aspiration that you slowly over time integrate. All right. So the final one on you want to take that final one in the decision making?
So let's talk about the people that lead with introverted feelings. These are going to be IFPs, ISFPs, and INFPs. They're going to lead with that introverted feeling process. That's going to be their dominant or driver process. We've nicknamed it authenticity. And that means that their 3-year-old or inferior process in their cognitive function stack or their CAR model is going to be extroverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed effectiveness. Now, we talked about effectiveness being the strength of ETJs. It is the challenge and the inferior process, or the 3-year-old process, for all IFPs. So this idea of getting things accomplished, streamlining processes, managing large amounts of resources, managing projects. Not to say that IFPs can't get things done or make things happen in the outside world, but you start stacking complexity to that. Project management, for example, the more people that have to be managed, the more resources and moving parts there are, the more challenge that's going to be for an IFP, because this is just not their strength. This is going to be a 3-year-old process for them. And so often I think this aspiration can show up in an IFP feeling very strongly about things that need to be different in the world. They want maybe the structure of something to change. Their heart feels in alignment with it. They feel impassioned about it. And they have an aspiration to maybe change something on a very big infrastructural level, but they may not have the skill or the know-how in that 3-year-old process in order to make that effectual change in the outside world happen. And so this is something that I think is an aspiration for them to want to do, to make this impact in a physical, tangible, results-oriented way, and not really sure how to start or how to get that done in a healthy, not healthy, it's the wrong word, in a way that makes sense for them, because that's just not how they're wired, I guess is how I'd say it.
I think one of the ways that this shows up, like effectiveness or extroverted thinking shows up as a blind spot, a way that IFPs resist it or push it away, is this idea that, like concepts like power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I always think of it as a very IFP motto, that this idea that if you plug yourself into some sort of system and you become powerful over other people, that it's almost like the position itself corrupts you, and that you aren't able to be, kind, or you won't be able to work well in the benefit of other people. So sometimes it's a resistance to even like plug yourself into society in general. It's almost like a mildly anarchistic way of seeing things, or even just, I'm going to do it on my own, right? Like I'm just going to figure it out on my own, and I don't need to be a part of any sort of system, and I don't need to be a part of anything like that. And there's a nobility in being a rogue element.
Or an idealism almost.
Yeah, exactly. Like an idealism around being able to make big things happen without having any sort of structure underneath you. And I think the way that an IFP understands the aspirational piece, which is like you mentioned, Joel, this idea of getting something big accomplished, right? Like a movement, or like, trying to create massive change in the world, and wanting to really maybe even have an impact through art, or have an impact through some sort of performance or ability to really reach a lot of people. You're always going to have a structure underneath you. And you're always going to have, a team of people who are helping you out, or you're a part of that team. So I think it's that 5 to 10% piece that you can do every day is figuring out how projects happen, and maybe putting yourself into a project scenario where you have a team that is engaged in the project. And you might not even need to lead it. It might just be sort of like understanding that the bigger the goal, the more momentum and the more people and resource have to be involved in it. So if you find yourself pushing this idea of structure away from you and wanting to be kind of mildly anarchistic, or just figure it out all on your own, so to speak, that's you marginalizing that part of who you are that has the desire to make an impact, right? Because the way that 3-year-old is sort of whispering in your ear is like, we can make big things happen. That's how it wants to do things, is it wants to make something big happen. And that's the aspiration, is making a major impact. But if you shush it, or if you don't integrate that piece of who you are, then its whispering will only be a frustration for you. All it's going to be is a desire that goes nowhere. Some of the most impactful people have been impactful through, say, writing, right? They've written these amazing concepts and thoughts, or books, or works of fiction or nonfiction. But right now I'm getting a major education on what goes into writing a book, and it takes a team. Like it takes a lot of people to like have an impactful book be written. And so that's this idea of just on a 5 to 10% level, just sort of, it's not just a matter of working tirelessly. That's a piece of it, right? Getting into action, making things happen. But it's working tirelessly and working smart, right? It's working hard and working smart with resources and groups. So that 5 to 10 is maybe sort of just inject yourself into a project with other people and get more of a realistic perspective on how big things happen.
Yeah, and committing to things that you're going to have to do even if you don't feel like it. Having an external structure, in some ways, giving you a sense of you got to do this regardless of how you feel in the moment, which I think is something, I'm not even an IFP, I'm an EFP, and I resist that to some degree. Like, I don't want to, if I don't feel like it, I don't want to have to do it, but I know that's how I can get traction, by going ahead and tethering myself to that outside of myself. Now, you'd mentioned that was our final one, and I think what you meant by that was the final one for the judging functions, or the functions that make decision-making functions, covering. We actually have four more of these inferiors we want to cover, but I'm wondering why don't we do a second part to this in the next show, the next episode, and cover those. Those are all the learning functions, or the perceiving functions, basically. And let's talk about those 4 in the next episode. Let's conclude this today. Mm-hmm. And I think this will be good to break it up into 2 parts, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, I think that's good, because I kind of want to flesh out those 2. And I think this will become an extremely long single podcast, or like 2 reasonable shorter podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's do that. So
let's stop here for a pause here. We're going to pick it up in the next episode. And in the meantime, we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can find this episode and leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
Yeah, if you're one of the types that we talked about, you lead with a judging process, decision-making process, you're an EJ or an IP, we've hit 8 different personality types. I'd love to hear how your 3-year-old or inferior process is an aspiration for you, and what you've done in order to integrate this into your life, and maybe some of the strategies that you're thinking about implementing in order to just kind of maybe 5 to 10% it, right? Just add a little bit more peppering into your life about how you're going to really integrate this inferior process. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.